Let's look at what we're going to be covering tonight. Of course, tonight we're going to finish off the Northern Alliance invasion of Israel. And then from last week, remember, we found out that this Northern Alliance includes Russia, of course, and a few of the other countries. But tonight, what we're going to cover tonight is the timing of this invasion. And also we'll look at the 5 different views that cover this, especially this particular event. And so the views that we'll look at tonight. Now, of course, the view that the author of this book, which is Arnold Fruchtenbaum, his view is the 5th view there, which is the pre-tribulation view. What's good is that it's good for us to also understand the other 4 views as well. So tonight there's the mid-tribulation view, what they call the post-tribulation view or the Armageddon view. There's the interlude view, and of course there's the end of millennium view, and of course the pre-tribulation views. Now these views are in terms of where they place this Northern Alliance, because obviously that's the context we're going to be talking tonight. Is out of those 5 views is where they actually place this Northern Alliance invasion of Israel. And then after we cover that tonight, we'll go through the last of the 5 pre-tribulation events. It won't take long for those because most of those we've already covered. So they'll just be quick recaps of what we covered in chapter 2, which was the times of the Gentiles. Daniel, so it'll be a quick recap for us. So we'll go through those. It won't take long to quickly go through the one world government, 10 division kingdom, rise of the Antichrist, false peace and security, and then of course the 9th pre-tribulation event is the 7-year covenant. So that's what we'll be covering tonight. So tonight really to start off is really the timing of this invasion, and this timing of the invasion is really it really is a controversial question that's often asked, especially not just mainly of course with a lot of the different biblical scholars and also in the Christian circles. And the controversial question in regards to this invasion is the timing of it. And so the question often is framed: when in the chronology of the prophecy will this event occur? And so, and that's what we'll be looking at in regards to this Northern Alliance invasion. Now, there's some basic observations that we can look at, and in terms of we kind of already we really know what Arnold's view in terms of where this invasion takes place, and that's obviously the pre-tribulation view. But we've got to cover the other 4 views that have a different view, and we need to look at those. So it gives us not just a biased view in terms of from Arnold's point of view, but it makes good sense for us to have a look at those other views and compare why their views are different, or why they are opposing views. Now, the basic observation to observe is that if we look at Ezekiel 38 verses 8 and 11 verses 12 and 14, and these are some of these passages that we already covered, but it's there that it's good to remind us that it already gives us clues of when the invasion takes place. And and so the invasion takes place when the first thing there is that Israel is a state again. So if you're reading Ezekiel 38 verse 8 there, that I've put on the right hand corner there, in verse 8 it says, "After many days they shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, that is gathered out of many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste, but it is brought forth out of the prophets, out of the peoples, and they shall dwell securely, all of them." And so, just get rid of that logo. And so we know that from this passage, that's explaining that before the tribulation, that Israel has to be a state again. Hi, Marjorie. And so that's what there shall come into the land that is brought back from the sword. And we know that when we talked about this earlier in regards to what happened in the First World War. So it's out of that Israel becomes a state again in 1948. Now it also talks about the waste places of past centuries are again inhabited. So of course in that same verse it says, which have been a continual waste, but is brought forth out of the peoples, and there shall dwell securely all of them. So that's so what that confirms is that this particular invasion that we talked about in terms of the northern invasion from the north takes place when Israel is in this particular state where they are dwelling securely, and so in that passage there it gives us that clue. The other clue, of course, is in verse 11 and verses 12 of Ezekiel 38. It tells us that Israel is dwelling in unwalled villages. Now, this is a very good description of what they call the kibbutz. I'm not sure if all of you there are familiar with that. Is all the kibbutzes is these are communal villages that were set up in Israel. It's actually quite unique to Israel. So I'll explain what that is for those of you there that aren't familiar with this. But the kibbutz they're basically settlements that are scattered around Israel, and they're basically like the real collective communities. So their main thing is about being self. What's their word? Self sufficient, I guess, is the word, eh? So that there was founded in 1910, and it was founded by early pioneers there, and it was called a Degania at that time. So there's about 270 of these kibbutz around, but that's basically what they are. They're unwalled, basically, communities. So if you're looking at that passage that we talked about there, we see that, yes, sustainable, Josie, yeah, I like that word. That's what the word is. And so that's what this kibbutz is. And if you look at that passage, it says, I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. So this is it's describing of what is happening in Israel at the moment. And of course, we know that even in that passage in verse 14 of Ezekiel 38, it says, therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say unto Gog, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, in that day when my people Israel dwelleth securely, shalt thou not know it? So here it's saying here, and this is what's really happening with Israel at the moment, is that Israel is dwelling securely. So we know that Israel currently is dwelling securely, and so it's very feasible for this invasion to take place in regards to that. Now there's a before we go on, because when we look at those other four views, note that the word dwelleth securely here is security. It doesn't mean living in peace. So just take a note of that, as at this stage that passage is saying dwelleth securely, and which is not really the same as living in peace. Okay. In fact, if you look at that whole entire text, it doesn't speak of Israel as living in peace, and that's something for us to note at this point when we move on into explaining some of the other views. Now, the views that we're going to go through there quickly now is that we're going to go through the other four views, and each view will look at what those views hold in regards of this invasion, and then once we look at what their views are, we also look at the objections on those views and why it doesn't exactly fit. But let's explore these views. So the first view that we will excuse me, that we'll cover is the mid-tribulation view. And there's a twofold basis for this position. Of course, the first one there is the word there, dwelling securely. So they take that passage where it says dwelling securely as they interpret that as meaning to be a time of peace. And that's resulting from Israel's covenant with the Antichrist in Daniel 9 verse 27. So that's how they interpret that. The other, the second fold is that this invasion is viewed as being the same as that of the king of the north in Daniel 11 verse 40. So that's how the mid-tribulation view views this particular invasion in regards to those two passages in Daniel 9 verse 27, Daniel 11 verse 40. Now, remember last time I talked about when we talked about the northern invasion of Israel, there is there's 7 years of burning that Israel has to take. So after that whole army is destroyed by God, remember then it takes Israel 7 years of burning all of the weapons of war and turning it into, sustainable energy, Josie? And so that's how long it must take them. And then, of course, it takes another 7 months of burying straight after that, burying those soldiers. So if you look at that time frame of 7 years, and that's why it's important for us to take that note, because it's that time period that has to fit, that has to make sense when each of these views approach it. So obviously in the mid-tribulation view, I've put I've just put there as a timeline, and so the timeline in the middle there is the tribulation. I've put the numbers 1 to 7 being the 7 years. In the middle there, of course, is 3.5 years, and half of 7, of course. So if the mid-tribulation view puts this invasion smack in the middle, puts it in smack in the middle there, and so that will cause a bit of a problem, So already you can look at that that timeline that it doesn't seem to fit. But anyway, let's look at some of the other objections in regards to this view. Now, of course, obviously Arnold views that the term dwell securely, that's the first objection, the term dwell securely doesn't necessarily have to indicate peace. That's the first objection. The second objection is, now why would God, if you're looking at that timeline there in front of you, now why would God intervene at this point on Israel's behalf and then immediately allow the events of the second half of the tribulation? So if you look at that chart I'm looking at there, so if they say that this is going to happen in the mid-tribulation, we know from scriptures that the second half of tribulation is chaos, So why would they won't have time to be burning this sort of stuff 7 years, because you can see that it already goes past the second half of the tribulation, goes right into the millennium. So it doesn't make sense. So the second objection is it doesn't make sense for God to intervene at this point, halfway through the tribulation, only to immediately allow the events of the second half of the tribulation, which will do a lot of damage to Israel at that point. It just doesn't make sense. So that's the second objection. The third objection, remember, it's agreed with those holding this position that the events described in Daniel 11:40 does take place in the middle of the tribulation. But the only confusion is there they've confused Daniel 11 verse 40. Just take note of this. They confused Daniel 11 verse 40 and identified it with Gog of Ezekiel 38 verse 30. In Ezekiel 38 verses 1 to 39. chapter 39:16, they're actually two different events, or two different Gogs. So the king of the north in Daniel 11:40 is different from the Gog of Ezekiel 38, and so that's the difference. So just to be clear, Daniel 11:40 is talking about the king of the north, a different king of the north there, and we'll explain that a little bit later, whereas the king of the north and the Gog of Ezekiel are two different kings. Okay, so that's the third objection to that. Now, when we look at the book of, throughout the book of Daniel, references are made to the king of the south and the king of the north. So, all throughout that book there consistently applies this to Egypt, the king of the north, including this is Daniel 11:40, including the reference in verse 40. So, what is that, you remember, if you apply the consistent use of applying the same consistently when you apply to what they mean to certain things in the scriptures, the king of the north has always been consistently applied to Syria. The only problem is that when from of course this view here, they change it. So they accept that it's Syria in other passages, but when it comes to verse 40, then they say this is Russia. And so it's kind of wrong to apply that logic, because what they're trying to do is fit it with their narrative here. So they identify that with Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is not Russia. And so that's the difference there. So if we're going to have context and consistency, it demands that we need to apply the same reference to Syria. So the invasion of Daniel 11:40 is very distinct from the Ezekiel 38 and 39 invasion. I know it might sound confusing at the moment, but that's fine. If you rewatch this again and just listen to what I'm saying, you'll pick up that that's really the subtle differences here. So those that hold this mid-tribulation view, identify the king of north in Daniel 11:40 with the Gog of Ezekiel 38 and chapter 39, which is not the same. Now the fourth objection to this view is that, like we're looking at the chart in front of us, it doesn't solve the problem of the 7 months and the 7 years, So just looking off that chart, where I put that in the middle in regards to that 7-year period of 7 years of burning, that goes right across it takes up the whole second half of the tribulation, and that's a time when the Jews are in flight and they won't be able to bury any of their own dead, let alone those of the Russians. So it just doesn't make common sense, And the other thing too is the 7 years run right into the millennium. And now remember, the millennium is the 1,000 years of Christ. There's no need for continuing to burn anymore, because during the millennium, it's a new kingdom that Christ sets up. So that's why this view really fails to solve just that problem of that 7 years. You can see why that's an issue here. So that's the main problem there, is that second half. If you're going to say mid-tribulation, the second half of the tribulation is all chaos. So there's just no time for the Israelites to be able to do this. It will become a problem because they will already be facing pretty much a second type of Holocaust, where the Antichrist is all out to destroy all of the Jews. Next we look at the second view that places this invasion, and that's what they call the post-tribulation view, or the Armageddon view. So this view really is that the other one was mid-tribulation, but here they obviously place this invasion at the end of tribulation. So again, they hold that this invasion is the same as the Armageddon campaign of Ezekiel 38 and 39. But what we've got to remember here is, and if we're not already aware, but it'll be made clear, that this northern invasion is a lot of people have gotten the Gog mixed up with the Armageddon campaign, which there is an Armageddon campaign of Ezekiel 38-39, but it's different from this northern invasion we talked about last week. So there is a distinction between this invasion and the Armageddon campaign, which does happen at the end of the tribulation. So that's the only reason why. This is what the post-tribulation views this as, and they hold that this is the same as the northern invasion is the same as the Armageddon campaign. That's why they believe it to be at the end of tribulation. But the problem is, and it's quite obvious there, is. But we'll look at some of the other, in terms of the other objections too, in regards to just the obvious one that we see there, is if you say they haven't taken into account that 7 years of burning, if it happens right at the end of tribulation, guess where that 7 years creep into? It creeps into way past that 75-day interval, which we'll talk a bit more later, but it goes right into 7 years of the millennium. So what's the point of burning those weapons for war when Christ sets up his kingdom? Remember, that talks about a whole 1,000 years of peace, and no one will be poor. And so that's a whole new kingdom there. So it doesn't make sense that this invasion happens at the end of tribulation. So there are 7 problems with this view, and those 7 problems are, and this is to look at the question on your study guide, for those of you who are following your study guide, the 19th question on your page. So the 7 problems are, the first one is that there are definite allies mentioned, but they're limited in numbers. So while the other nations stand in opposition, the campaign of Armageddon, all nations are allied together against Jerusalem without exception. So remember, when we're talking about the northern invasion, it only included Russia and some of those nations. The difference with that invasion and the one that we're talking about, Armageddon, it says the whole lot of other, it's more countries. Basically, all the countries of the nations will gather against Israel, whereas the northern invasion, it only involves Russia. So that's the difference there. And the second objection is that Ezekiel invasion comes from the north, but the Armageddon invasion comes from the whole earth. So again, that's the same point that's made earlier. Then the third objection is the purpose of the Russian invasion is to take the spoil, but the purpose of the Armageddon campaign is to destroy all of the Jews. That's the purpose of it there. And so the fourth objection to this, as well as in terms of the Ezekiel invasion, is that there is a protest against the invasion in the Armageddon campaign. In the Ezekiel invasion there's a protest. Remember, there's a protest by the other countries. They question Russia as to why they're going in there. They're taking the spoils, but they don't do anything anyway because Russia invades anyway. But the Armageddon campaign, there's no protest at all from anyone. That's because all of the nations are involved in the Armageddon campaign, which is different from the Northern Invasion campaign. The fifth objection is the Ezekiel invasion is destroyed through the convulsions of nature. So God uses nature to destroy the Russian invasion, whereas the Armageddon invasion is destroyed by the personal second coming of the Messiah. So that's the difference of the Armageddon campaign as opposed to this Ezekiel invasion. The sixth objection is the Ezekiel invasion is destroyed on the mountains. Remember, they were on the mountains, so that's where they're destroyed, on the mountains of Israel. Now the Armageddon campaign, the difference is that this campaign is destroyed somewhere between Petra and Jerusalem. Of course, we'll go into this a bit more detail during the second coming chapters of this book. But that's just to say that that's the sixth objection to this particular view, and that the Ezekiel invasion is different from the Armageddon campaign. Then the seventh objection is the Russian invasion takes place while Israel is living securely in the land. Now that's different from living in peace. So Armageddon campaign takes place while Israel is in flight and in hiding. So that's the difference. So the Russian invasion, when that invades Israel, Israel is already secure in its security, in terms of that's confident in its security with its armed forces, whereas the Armageddon campaign, when they invade, or when that happens, and at the end of tribulation, Israel is already in flight because of the second half of the tribulation. The Antichrist is all out, wanting to destroy all of the Jews. So that's the difference between the two campaigns. And then, of course, I mean, that's the 7 objections to it, but if we go back to looking at where they place the 7 years burning, that's also an issue that they haven't really addressed. And so, yes, there is an Armageddon that happens at the end, but it's not the 7 years burning. And so the way to look at it is that well, the way Arnold's interpreted, where they object to this view, is that there's two invasions. So there's a Russian invasion, which we talked about with the Northern Alliance, and then that's different from the Armageddon invasion, which does happen at the end of the tribulation. So these are two distinct invasions. Okay, the next view is the interlude view. And this view is that this invasion happens between after the tribulation, but it's between the tribulation and the millennium. So when Christ sets up his new kingdom after the second coming, there's that period which they call the interlude. And so they basically view this period as the time to insert this invasion. So they say that so the basis of that is there's a period of time after the second coming and after Israel is restored, and just before the kingdom, that they say that this event will happen. So that's where they place it. So if you're looking at it again, if you look at that chart, in the middle there is the gap. Is what the scriptures call a 75-day interval. It's 75 days. This is straight after the second coming, and Jesus deals to the Antichrist and all of its enemies, and he's getting ready to prepare for the millennium kingdom. So it takes 75 days, according to scriptures, for the Messiah to recycle everything and get everybody ready for the new millennium. And so this view places that invasion again right smack in the middle of that period, but it's only 75 days. And the reason why we say it's 75 days is because the scriptures numbers those days as only just 75 days. And because Daniel 12 verses 12, so if you note that just make a note of that verse, Daniel 12 verses 12, it limits the interlude days straight after the Jesus at the end of tribulation as 75 days. And so that's where, if you're looking at there, then that becomes a problem, because 7 years of burning and even 7 months of burying doesn't fit within 75 days, eh? So that becomes an issue, and that's a problem. So the main objection is that this isn't consistent with the masses of scripture that describes the millennium and also of Israel. And so when we're looking at the actual 7 years that the Bible talks about in regards to this northern invasion, it just doesn't fit this view of the interlude view, when we already know it's only 75 days. The fourth view is, of course, the end of the millennium view, and of course we know that the millennium is the 1,000 years of Christ. So the fourth view is that it puts this northern invasion right at the end of the millennium. And if you look at Revelations 20, verses 7 to 9, actually, if we can read that. If you turn to Revelations 20, verse 7 to 9, and I'll read that. Revelations 20. Verses 7 to 9. So when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So that's that event there is how this particular view views this northern invasion, and they place it at the end of the millennium. But there's really two key objections to this view, and the first view or objection to this is that the invasion, remember we mentioned earlier, the Ezekiel invasion or the northern invasion that we talked about, comes from the north. But the Revelation view that we just talked about there, or the Revelation invasion, comes from all over the world. That's the difference. It doesn't come from the north. The one that we just read in Revelation talks about coming from all over the world. That's the first objection to that. The second objection is that, again, like the other view, if you look at that right in front of us, is that if that happens right at the end of the 1,000 years, remember God sets up a new eternal order at the end of the millennium kingdom, and that 7 years, again, they don't know how to address that. That goes right into the new eternal order where God makes a new heaven and a whole new earth, and heaven will be on earth. And so why would Israel be still mucking around burning war equipment for 7 years? There's no point. So again, that northern invasion becomes a bit of a thorn in that in this view here. So those are the two objections for this particular view. Now, the fifth view is, of course, the pre-tribulation view. And, of course, this is the view that Arnold holds. And again, we've already looked at it, that the northern invasion is very different from the campaign of Armageddon. And I think that's where the main differences of the interpretations for most of the other four views is that they consider those two invasions as one and the same. Whereas is the passages when we look at those passages, they're clearly talking about two different. There's the king of the north, and then of course there's the invasion of the worldwide invasion, which is the Armageddon campaign. So if we look at the text of Ezekiel again in 38, Ezekiel 38:1 and Ezekiel 39, we know that this view carries quite clear conclusions, I guess, if you're looking at it. And the first thing is that Israel is established before the tribulation. That's what the passages are talking about, So there's three conclusions of Ezekiel 38 and Ezekiel chapter 39. And the first is that Israel is established. We know that in 1948 is established as a state, and they're dwelling securely too. The second conclusion is the Russian Confederacy invades Israel during this time of security, and this is before the tribulation. And the third conclusion is that we know that the Confederacy is then destroyed actually in Israel before the tribulation. That's what this view would hold, is that Now it can also run if you slide that 7 years. It could also just happen before the 7 year, and so it may run into some parts of the first part of the tribulation. But nonetheless, the main thing is that this event, in order for it to fit, it has to happen before the tribulation, at least anyway. And so in terms of support, there's several views supporting, or there's several points in terms of that, when you're looking at this pre-tribulation view that supports it. And the first point is that what we see is the description of Israel found in this passage fits really well with the way Israel is at the moment, if you really would agree with it. Especially before the tribulation, we know that Israel, we already covered in the first part of our session tonight, is that the current state of Israel fits those passages, or describes exactly where Israel is at the moment. Israel is a land that's brought back from the sword in verse 38, in Ezekiel 38 verse 8. Man, you've got to look at it that after 1900 years, you look at 46, Israel's seen 46 invasions. We've seen them have the War of Independence. The land is Jewish again, currently, and it's free from foreign domination at the moment. So this nation is gathered from many nations and peoples, which we see in Ezekiel 38 verse 8 and also verse 12. We also know that the Jews in Israel today come from 80 to 90 different nations. So they're gathered on from many peoples. The continual waste places that Ezekiel talks about are now inhabited. That's what's happening today in Israel. We also know that the Israelis today are rebuilding the ancient places, and they're also turning them into modern day towns. For those of you that do follow a lot of the Israeli, if you follow a lot of their news or subscribe to some of their newsletters, you will know that currently there's a lot of things happening there at the moment in terms of Israel. Now, verses 11 and 14 of Ezekiel 38, they dwell securely, that phrase that we've already looked at. And this has often been, from what I see from Arnold's comments here, is that it's often been misconstrued as meaning a state of peace. But that's not really the meaning of the Hebrew root batach, B-A-T-A-C-H. The nominal root of this word just simply means security. Yes, so in terms of the security, that's what we're talking about in regards to a lot of people misconstrue. Yeah. That passage there in Ezekiel 38, verses 11, where it talks about they dwell securely. And so that's often been interpreted as meaning state of peace, but that's not what it means. It just simply means the root name. The root of it in Hebrew means security. Now remember, we know that today they're not actually living in peace. Remember, there's still a lot of attacks, but they are secure. You know that the Israeli forces are amongst the best in the world. They've already beaten a lot of countries already, and we know that with the 6-Day War and lots of other battles around the Middle East. They're not a country to be messed with. As small as they are in the Middle East, Israel is secure in their armed forces. So they're not certainly the little kid that gets bullied now by other nations. They're very secure in who they are, and they can handle themselves as well. So what we see is that when we read earlier that passage, it simply is that in terms of this pre-tribulation view, in terms of where those passages talk about where the invasion, this particular invasion, does take place when Israel is in this state. And so that's what's describing here. So all of those descriptions in Ezekiel 38, verses 8 up to verses 12 and 14, is really descriptive of what happens today with the kibbutz, and even with the way that their security forces are. So that was the first point of supporting this view. The second point in supporting this view of pre-tribulation is that what we see is that in Russia today, in spite of the fall of the communism, really, Russia is still a major world power today. Russia is still a very powerful nation in terms of today. Now, Russia's rise only continued to, for those of you familiar with the history during the Second World War and even in the early 19th century where Russia's concerned, they weren't a superpower until the reestablishment of Israel, basically. So when Israel was reestablished in World War II, the rise of Russia increased significantly. And so they became very well established since then, coinciding with Israel. So the third support, of course, for this view is that this view, if you look at the chart again, when you're looking at trying to solve the problem of that 7 years burning, you can place that, it has to be placed before. So even if it overlaps a little bit and happens ahead. Now, Arnold's put that event before. Obviously, the other pre-trib events, there's the One World Government, 10 Division, Antichrist, False Peace, and that. But he's only put that there because that could happen anywhere in between of those two things. It may happen after the One World Government, or may even trigger how the One World Government will be formed. But he's put it there so then because at this point that's just one of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, one of the 6 remaining pre-trib events that the scriptures talk about that happens before the tribulation. So that's what you call the pre-tribulation events. So if we're looking at this view, this pre-tribulation view, I mean it pretty much helps explain the problem of this 7 years of burning, and that's the time frame that we're looking at. So it must at least, so when you're looking at this view helps us, one, it fits with the passages that we've already studied in regards to where this northern invasion, how that occurs. It also helps us define what that invasion involves, which very much fits the current status that we're in regards to where Russia is concerned today. Also what's currently happening in regards to that area. Russia is really behind a lot of the scenes in regards to where Syria is concerned. They're supplying a lot of the arms for a lot of the Muslim countries, especially with Iran. I think the last is a large number of the Russians are now Muslim. So yeah, so they're building in power, and it'll be interesting to see what they get up to within the next few years. But there's certainly this event, especially for us, when the more I look at this is, I mean, if Lord willing we're still here, we're not raptured, would be an incredible event to witness in regards to biblical prophecy on a huge scale that a lot of us, I mean, bar the second coming, of course, but this would be something that really would be God's footprint or God's mark on what he's going to do. Now, as well as those views that support this, of course, there is 2 objections to this view, and we have to be fair and also say that there are objections to this pre-tribulation view, and we've got to go through that. And a lot of them are related, obviously, regards to what we already covered in regards to the views that we've already covered. But there are 6 objections to this pre-tribulation view, and we need to talk about those as well. So the first objection in regards to this view here is that the Ezekiel 38:39 passage is in the restoration section of Ezekiel. That's what the first objection is talking about. Now, what Arnold's noted here, if that's what is objected to, and that they're saying that that passage is talking about the restoration section of Ezekiel, then yes, the answer to that is true, but which restoration are they talking about? Remember when we talk about the regatherings, the two regatherings of Israel? There was a regathering in unbelief, or is it the final regathering in faith? So that's the answer to from Arnold's point of view in terms of that objection, is when they're talking about the restoration section of Israel. So faith really begins with Israel after this invasion. And the chronology of the book of Ezekiel wouldn't be a problem for this view, because the restoration of faith is already covered by Ezekiel, Ezekiel 40 and Ezekiel 48. The second objection to this view, or this pre-tribulation view, is that, and it's one that's most commonly used, and we've already covered that, is the dwelling safely or securely, where they take it to mean peace. And so that's we've already kind of covered that, but that's the objection there, and that it is true that I'm just looking at Arnold's notes here. It is true that the Old Testament always refers to millennial peace and security, but this is something that Israel won't receive before the tribulation. But while it is true that the term "dwell securely" is used of life in the millennium, this is only really true of the minority of cases, but not all true of majority of the cases. So there's a list of references where this is not true, and I'll just give you the biblical passages for you to write down, and you can check these out for yourself. So these are a list of references where this dwelling safely is not true in regards to a millennial type of peace. So Leviticus 25 verse 18 and verse 19. Repeat that. Leviticus 25, 18 and 19. Deuteronomy 12 verse 10. 1 Samuel 12 verse 11. 1 Kings 4, 25, Psalm 4, verse 8, Psalm 16, verse 9, Proverbs 1, verse 33, Proverbs 3, verse 23 and 29, Isaiah 4, verse 47, Jeremiah 49, verse 31, and then the last one is Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 15. Now the Jeremiah reference there is quite significant, and that's because it uses the very same phrase that's found in Ezekiel 38 and verse 11. And so this phrase is used more in terms of a non-millennial context than in terms of the millennial ones. So there's a third objection to this view, and that third objection is that this contradicts the doctrine of imminency. I'll explain what that is for those of you who are not familiar with what that term means. It's referring to when the church is raptured. The Bible teaches that that the rapture is imminent, which means that can happen any time. There's no kind of time from it. Nobody knows the time or whenever, and so this is referring to the in terms of the rapture. Now, Arnold's argument is that stating that something has to happen before the tribulation is not the same as stating that it must happen before the rapture. The thing is with the rapture, and where a lot of the confusion is, the rapture itself, although it may happen, doesn't set off the tribulation. It's not tied to. It doesn't. The rapture doesn't. The scriptures doesn't teach that the rapture is what sets off the tribulation, and that's where there's a lot of views are a little bit confused with. So what sets off the tribulation is the signing of the peace treaty, but it's got nothing to do with the rapture. See, we may be raptured tomorrow, but the tribulation may not start. It may not start till 50 years after we're gone. So there's nothing to say that. The main thing is the rapture isn't what will determine the tribulation. Now so it doesn't. Arnold's view is that the rapture is an imminent event that will happen. That's what it means. It will happen before the tribulation, but it's not something that will trigger off. It's not necessarily something that has to happen in order for the tribulation to happen. And so there's a fourth objection, and the fourth objection states is that, and it talks about that, the fourth objection to this pre-tribulation view is that they say, well then how can Israel apostatize so soon? This is talking about this invasion, that after the invasion, yes, a lot of them come to faith, but it also talks about how a lot of them will also be fall away from faith, which is what that term apostatize means. Again, after the nation has just witnessed a revival. But Arnold's, it's funny how Arnold answers is, well, why should this be a problem? And the reason why he says that is that he was just citing examples of what happened to a lot of the Jewish people in the Old Testament. When we look at what we know of Israel in the Old Testament, remember, straight after they were led out of Egypt, straight after all the miracles of the parting of the Red Sea, what did they do? They quickly fell into apostasy. The miracles of Exodus and the recognition of God at Sinai, all of these events, straight after that, Israel fell straight into apostasy, and some of them even worshipped the calf. They didn't really acknowledge God. So what Arnold's saying is that why should that be a problem even after this event happens? Israel will do what human beings tend to do. Hey, we sin, and so Arnold doesn't see that as an issue, which is what this fourth objection is talking about. The next objection, or the fifth objection to the pre-tribulation view, is that again, we touch on this, is that it talks about that it happens in the latter days and years. But really, what this objection is really based on is there's a faulty assumption that this particular view holds to a pre-rapture position, which isn't really true. The position of a pre-tribulation invasion is that it's not a pre-rapture invasion. This invasion, the rapture doesn't have to happen before the rapture. The rapture doesn't have anything to do with this. This is a pre-tribulation event, so that's the difference there. Then you've got the sixth and final objection to this, is that states that Israel won't gain any title to the land, nor have the right to return to this land until they sign the covenant with the Antichrist. That's what the sixth objection is. The problem with this statement is that those who hold to this opinion, they also go on to state that this view, that they also say that this covenant has to be signed before the rapture. But again, we already talked about that that this invasion's got nothing to do with the rapture. This invasion's got everything to do with the before tribulation. So there's this again. This view is confusing the rapture as some sort of event that would trigger off the tribulation, but the rapture is a totally different event. Now I won't go into too much more about the rapture because we will be going about the rapture in a lot more detail in chapter 6 next Wednesday, and that will give a lot more detail in regards to what I'm saying here. But the reality is that the rapture is definitely not a trigger for any of those events. The rapture, if you're looking, if we're looking at the chart now, the rapture can happen any time between now and any time leading up to the signing of that treaty, irrelevant of any of those other pre-tribulation events. Nobody knows when the Lord will return. All we know is that the Lord has promised that He will return and take the body of believers before the tribulation, is what this view is holding. That concludes in terms of the northern invasion, and I guess in terms of the northern invasion, which is, I didn't realize how significant it was until I guess reading through this chapter and studying it. That's quite a major pre-tribulation event. But also I didn't realize just how that particular event, there's a lot of controversy around it, and especially with those other four views that are in the Christian circles today. The other thing I want to encourage us is that you will find a lot of believers will argue over these especially with these Bible prophecies, and they'll say, which are you pre-trib or you mid-trib? The thing is, amongst a lot of those believers there, it's not a salvation issue, I guess is what I want to say here. Don't get too caught up on which camp that you're in. The main thing is that we bear the fruits of the Spirit, is that the gospel is not tainted. We can all argue from these particular facts, but it's the gospel that unites us, and we may differ in these opinions. You'll find a lot of these guys, they always tease each other, and these even with the Bible scholars, they have a good joke with amongst themselves, and it's not a tribal thing on which camp that you follow, but because a lot of them understand that the main thing is the gospel of Jesus Christ and the sound doctrines we hold to. That's the basis of our faith. These things we can all differ on the views of rapture or differ on the views of these events, but the main thing is that Christ is held at the highest value, and not just over these things that we're talking about. So I just want to encourage you, don't get too caught up on when you come across someone else with a different view, or get upset that they don't follow the views that is presented here. This is just good things amongst family that we in Christ we can study these things, we can talk about speculative things, but here we can say that with joy that we study His Word and try and come to some form of wisdom around it. Amen. Okay, so we're nearly there. That was our case. Anyway, so next we're going to. So I guess in terms of that timeline, now that we know a little bit more what this northern invasion will occur, so I guess for us, keep an eye out for it. I guess be watching the news with some interest around what will happen with where Russia is concerned, along with the Allies, especially where Israel is concerned. But now we come to the fifth birth pang, and which is the one world government. Now we've already covered this. Remember, these are the events that we covered in the earlier chapter for times of the Gentiles. And so what will happen is there will be a one world government. So currently we know that at the moment, the way the world is, and it's funny how all this COVID and everybody's all global, at the moment there's a balance between the East and the West. So at the moment we're in the united stage or in regards to the fourth kingdom. And so the stage that we're in now will eventually lead to the one world government. Now, because we just already covered the northern invasion, I was thinking the other day how would this one world government come to pass. But remember, we just covered the northern invasion, and we know that Russia is completely taken out when they do invade Israel along with the other nations. That means that out of the balance of power where the East and the West have, losing Russia, and then Germany, of course, losing those countries leaves a very unbalanced East and West, no longer becomes balanced. So it can only lead to a one world government at that stage. Maybe the United Nations may step in and create something there. Anyway, it's all speculation, but it's something perhaps worth considering. So we know that this is what will lead to, and currently the state that we're in now will lead to this one world government. And from there, of course, we'll go to the sixth birth pang. And the sixth birth pang that the Bible talks about is the 10-division kingdom. 10-division kingdom. Don't you find it interesting that what's happening in the Pacific and also around our area? It's remember before a lot of the early Bible prophetic followers would always say that this particular 10-division kingdom was always centered around the European Council, or around the European market. But the scriptures is talking about the whole earth, not just the European area. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but if you're talking about the world divided in 10 regions, you have the South Pacific, maybe be one region. I don't know who's going to run that. You may have Australia and New Zealand combined. It's funny that all of the political powers are all... Because New Zealand on its own is quite insignificant, really. But when you look at a lot of the global things, and even Nick understands with all of the political things going around regards to bills being passed, I would say there will be a leader that will eventually govern a region in this area. And then you've got the South America, North America. So it's very believable that a 10-kingdom or 10-division kingdom will happen after the one world government. When it will happen, the Bible is not clear on when this happened. All it gives us is the chronological order, is that the one world government happened first, and then it will lead into a 10-division kingdom. Maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years after the one world government. Who knows? But one thing's for sure is there definitely will be a 10-division kingdom. So the 10 kingdoms with 10 kings who will rule the world. This will be the sixth birth pang of what the scriptures are talking about. Next, we have the rise of the Antichrist. We've got this fella, and this is the seventh birth pang. And here, of course, Daniel 7. Verse 24 is a classic one, and then it says, "And another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the former, and he shall put down 3 kings." So obviously during the 10 kingdom phase, the Antichrist rises. He's the little horn, remember, and he takes out 3 of those kings. So he again destroys 3 kings in that 10-division kingdom. And then the other 7 kings then obviously get behind the Antichrist. So the Antichrist rises to power. That's the 7th pre-tribulation event. This is before the actual tribulation itself. So we get to see the rise of this particular person. Now, in those passages it says the day of the Lord. It refers, so what does the day of the Lord always refer to? Remember, the day of the Lord always refers to the tribulation. That's what it always refers to. So first, remember, it said that there has to be the apostasy or the falling away. And so remember, the falling away is the church apostasy has to happen. And then when that happens as well, then we also begin to see the man of sin will be revealed as well. Now, we can definitely know who he is, obviously, because he will sign a treaty at the beginning of tribulation. So, there's two events that has to happen before the tribulation or the seventh birth pang happens, and that's the two events we just saw previously, which is the one world government and the 10 world division. So those two things have to happen before the rise of the Antichrist. Yeah. So all of those that are trying to find the Antichrist now, trying to call whoever it is the Antichrist now, I think we're a little bit premature, because there's a few events that have to happen. One is the one world government, and also the 10 division kingdom has to happen as well. Next, we look at that 8th birth pang, and that's there's a period of false peace and security. If you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 to 3, but concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that anything be written unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. When they are saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall in no wise escape. So another event leading up to this tribulation is what I've just read there, is that event found in 1 Thessalonians. So this is concerning the times and the seasons. Again, the term of the day of the Lord is referring to the tribulation. That's what it's referring to. And this is talking about at a time when the people or the men are saying peace and safety. And then suddenly the destruction of the tribulation suddenly hits with a devastating force. So this is that period where they think they're in peace, and then all of a sudden the tribulation suddenly hits them. That's what it's saying here. And this fact will require this period to come just before the act that initiates the tribulation itself. So while all the world is under the 10 kingdoms and the Antichrist is rising to power, it will be during this period where there will be a false sense of peace and false security. But once the tribulation comes about, this will be totally shattered. And so here we see the same description, a travail upon a woman with a child, and we also see that here used again. So the 8th birth pang is this period of false peace and security. The last one that we'll be covering tonight is the 7-year treaty, or the 7-year covenant. This will be the 9th birth pang, and it's leading up to the tribulation, but this event will begin officially the tribulation, and that is the actual signing of the treaty between the Antichrist and Israel. So those are the two key parties to note about what this means. So the Antichrist will obviously formulate a peace treaty with Israel. Now remember, this presupposes that Israel is already a state. So this also proves again what Scripture is saying. So this peace treaty is signed. Israel, whoever leads Israel at that moment, signs with the Antichrist. They sign a 7-year peace treaty. And then we know that halfway through this 7-year treaty, it's broken by the Antichrist. So it's 3.5 years of peace, but then there'll be 3.5 years of total chaos during that period in the tribulation. And so, in summary, these are the events that we've just covered. So these are the 9 pre-tribulation events that we will look at. That we have just covered, and hopefully now you're familiar with those events. and those are what the scriptures tell us that will happen before the tribulation, leading up to the signing of that treaty. But so hopefully we're a little bit more wiser than before. For those of us that were never really familiar around these terms, a lot of the people that study eschatology or Bible prophecies, hopefully now for us, we'll be a little bit more wiser in terms of some of the views, the mid-trib views and post-trib views and pre-trib views. Hopefully we're now more familiar with these terms. And on that note, in chapter 5 that's coming up on Sunday, we'll be covering, and that'll be a short one too, but we'll be covering other pre-tribulation events. And the reason they're not noted here is because they don't follow a chronological order, and they may fall anywhere between. It is why we're covering that anyway. We're going to be looking at some major blackouts that will happen during the pre-tribulation. So these are some of the other events. We look at how Elijah comes on the scene, where the Bible talks about that. And so there's some other events there that be worth mentioning for us to look at. Obviously the rapture is one of them, but that'll be covered in more detail in chapter 6.